This happened the summer I turned 19. It was a string of days that should have been ordinary beach trips, barbecues, late-night drives, and a few too many cold sodas in the passenger seat, but instead became 5 separate nights that left my skin thin and my sleep tethered to a light bulb. I was living in a small coastal town called Harbor Ridge, working odd jobs and trying to pay for school when it all started. The heat that summer felt like an animal pressing against the windows, and every small noise seemed louder because of it. I will tell you all 5 stories exactly as they happened, because each one changed me in a way I could not have predicted. I will tell you names, the sounds, the smells, and the moments when I decided to keep quiet, and the moments when I could not. I grew up somewhere inland with parents who were practical and precise. My mother, Sarah, taught piano to neighborhood kids and could list every screw in a lamp by memory. My father, Mark, fixed engines and had a laugh that always shook his shoulders. I left for the coast after my second year of college because I needed a place where nothing reminded me of a mistake I had made back home. That mistake was a relationship that ended in a scream at 3 in the morning and a door slammed so hard the window rattled. I promised myself I would not live in anyone else's chaos again. I took a small room above a bakery, rented my bicycle, and learned the rhythm of tides and grells and the late shift at a convenience store. I had a few close friends, Lena, who worked at the marina, Miguel, who painted houses, and Evan, who lived down the block and played guitar poorly and loudly, but with all his heart. I learned to be careful about trust, the hard way, because the world taught me patience by breaking things I loved. That backstory mattered because when the first thing happened, I was already half awake to how quickly life can tilt. I was not perfect, and I was not brave by nature. I was human with a scar in my memory and a tendency to believe in routine. That summer, I also carried a small notebook with doodles and a cheap camera because I liked to document light. I never imagined those tools would become the difference between remembering and forgetting. The first night was the shallow one, the one that felt like a nudging at first and then a hand. I had been at Miguel's for a bonfire after work and got home around midnight. The street smelled of salt and a bakery oven still hummed from the day. I locked the front door because my mother had always nagged me to be careful and the lock clicked solid. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator and the fan in my bedroom. I laid on the couch with the television on a muted blue glow and fell into a sleep that was not restful. Hours later, light stabbed my closed eyelids. I opened them, and the living room was cooler than the rest of the house, a patch of darkness where rain had not yet reached the porch, but where something else had moved. My hand found the notebook under my knee, and my phone read 2:23. I stood up slow enough that it felt like the air would notice. Then I saw it. The front window had condensation, and across the inner sill there were 3 muddy footprints, small enough for a shoe like Evan's, except he wore flip-flops, and those prints looked like a boot. I remembered thinking of a childhood ghost story of footprints that appeared after storms, and laughing at myself in a voice that sounded borrowed. Then footsteps on the porch, the slow dragging kind, like someone balancing a weight, and the knob turned, not fully, but enough to test the lock. I froze. We had a rapid exchange, although it was only me in the house and the sound outside. I whispered, "What if someone was trying the door?" And then I went to the window and said out loud, "Who is there?" like a dare. The voice on the porch was low, a male voice that said, "You home, kid?" It had no name in it, just pressure. I opened the blinds a slat at a time. I could see a shadow, a hunched form, the teeth of his boots caked in a gray mud that smelled like the marsh. I remembered my father telling me never to open to strangers, and then I heard the voice again, asking if anyone had seen a dog. It was a lie, but the voice knew how to sound harmless. So I answered with a voice that tried to be steady, "Hey, no dog here." The man said, "Oh, sorry," and his hand knocked the glass lightly like a test. I backed away from the window and dialed Miguel, although I knew he was drunk at the beach, and this felt ridiculous. My phone rang once, twice. He picked up with slurred, "Hey?" And when I told him there was someone outside, he said, "Lock the door and call the cops." I did both. Officer Ramirez came 10 minutes later, lights red on his cruiser cutting through the dark, and the man on the porch was gone. They dusted for prints, found nothing conclusive, and I was left with the impression of boot treads, a smear of mud, and a voice. That night, I did not sleep without the lamp on. My chest felt full of small stones. The second story involved the same town, but a different kind of closeness. Lena invited me to a house party on the third week when the heat was at its thickest and the smell of sunscreen and burgers made everything seem safe. We were laughing outside when someone yelled about fireworks and the crowd moved toward the beach. Later, when the group thinned and people drifted into sleeping bags, someone noticed that Maya, who had come with us, had not returned. Her boyfriend Tyler started searching with a flashlight that cut across the dunes. I remember the panic, like a hand squeezing down on my throat. We found Maya near the lifeguard tower, sitting on a towel, shaking and clutching a sweatshirt. She was soaked, as if someone had poured water over her head, but there was no one there. Her voice in the dark was small, and she kept saying something about a whisper at the waterline that said her name. At first, we thought she had wandered near the ocean and tripped, but her shoes were by the boardwalk, and there were 2 sets of footprints leading from the parking lot toward the dunes, and then only one leaving. The footprints were smeared, as if someone had been dragged, or had dragged something. Lena said it looked like the prints had been made by someone running, with the heel catching. We called the lifeguard and the police again. Officer Ramirez eventually arrived, and this time he brought a patrol partner named Garcia, who had a flashlight that felt clinical. They asked Maya questions, and she could not articulate what happened, only that she heard someone whisper her name and felt someone breathe near her ear. Tyler accused a prankster, and the crowd wanted to believe in pranks. Miguel argued that the ocean could play tricks with sound. We argued like people who need to be right about simple things to avoid being scared. Maya would not go back to the dunes for a week after that. The third incident is the one that became a dream and then a waking memory that would not be trusted. It began with a recurring nightmare that I could not shake. I would be walking home along Harbor Road at dusk, and the same figure would stand under the sodium street lamp, a man, tall and thin, with something reflective in his hand. Each dream started with the street lamp flickering, and then a slight smell of oil, like a car that had been left idling too long. In the dream, the man would lift his hand, and I would see a signature inked on his palm, like a stamp, the letters unreadable, and then I would wake with my heart racing. After 3 weeks, the dream came into waking life. The first time I saw the man in real life, he was leaning against a lamppost at midnight, watching me come back from the convenience store. I froze because the dream had taught me how the light would catch on whatever he held. He did not speak at first, but when I got close, he said, "Evening." Then he stepped forward, and the thing in his hand gleamed. I held it was metal, a key maybe, or a small knife. I held my bag tighter and said, "I live here, please just leave." He tilted his head, and in a voice that was too soft for the street, said, "You should not have left the back door open." He said it like a fact, like the end of a sentence. I asked how he knew about the back door, and he smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. He said, "The house tells me things." I laughed to cover my skin crawling and said, "Whoever told you that is twisted." He took another step and said, "Names tell me things." And then he threw a scrap of paper at my feet. On it, there was a single name, my childhood nickname, and a date that was yesterday. Dialogue on Harbor Road that night unfolded like a slow interrogation. I said, "Who are you?" The man said, "I am someone who watches people." And then he asked, "Why are you walking alone?" He said, "Are you scared?" I said, "Yes," and tried to move past him. He blocked my path with a casual step, like someone moving through air, and said, "Do not run." The man had a voice that could still water, and there was a rhythm to his sentences that made it hard to breathe. I told him, "You are scaring me." The man said, "You are not the first." He laughed, and the laugh was wet, and someone else behind it was a second breath. I called Lena, and she answered, "Don't hang up." And then I shouted into the phone, "Hey, there is a guy who says he watches. I need you to come now." She said, "I'm 2 blocks away." In the distance, I heard shoes on sand. Lena arrived with Miguel behind her, and the man melted into the shadows like oil into water. We reported it the next day, and the scrap of paper was logged as evidence. The recurring dream stopped for 1 week and then returned with a new detail, a line of dirt under the man's nails. The repetition turned the dream into memory, and memory into threat. One of the stories culminated in something physical that was hard to put into words. It was an afternoon at the pier when Evan and I and a group of kids decided to jump off the boards and race to the buoy. The sun was a harsh coin, and the smell of fish fried in oil filled the air. On the way back, Evan and I cut through a storage lot behind the bait shop because it was a shortcut, and because Evan liked the way his skateboard clicked on concrete. The lot looked empty, except for stacked crates, a dented blue cooler, and a van with its side door slightly open. I remember the smell of stale bait and oil and the sticky sweet of spilled soda from a wrapper nearby. We heard a noise like someone whispering, and then a sound more human, a muffled cry. There in the van, on top of a pile of fishing nets, we found a girl about my age, bound at the wrists and gagged. Her hair was tangled with sand, and there was a bruise along her temple. The sight of her made my stomach lean forward and fall. Evan swore his face went white, and he slammed the van door with his shoulder. We had to act. I have never moved faster in my life. I pulled the gag loose, and she coughed and said, "Thank you," through tears. She introduced herself as Carla and said she had been taken from the party at the prom that week, 2 towns over, and had been driven here. There were tire tracks in the lot that matched a van that had been reported by a neighbor a few nights earlier, a white van with a logo scraped off. We called the police, and this time, Officer Ramirez arrived with a detective named Dr. Patel from the county office, who specialized in assault cases. The detective took statements and explained the protocol, and her voice made me feel like something precise was being done. I remember the way Carla held my hand in the patrol car and how small she seemed next to the vinyl seat lights flashing in my face like questions. The technical side of what followed had a clarity that contrasted with how chaotic it felt. The police ran a trace on the vehicle registration, checking VIN numbers against reported thefts, and used surveillance footage from a nearby gas station to establish a route. Forensic teams photographed the scene, documented the binding, and collected fibers from the van interior. The initial forensic report indicated fibers consistent with the netting in the van and a partial fingernail impression on the inside of the door. The procedure was clinical, methodical, and necessary, and it made some part of me calm to know there were steps being followed. The dialogues during that rescue were rapid and full of raw edges. Evan said, "We have to get her out now." I said, "Call 911." Evan dialed with shaking hands. I told Carla, "It's okay, you are safe here." She whispered, "Thank you." I asked, "Who did this to you?" She blinked and said, "I do not know." The detective said, "Stay on this curb and do not let anyone touch the evidence." The neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, crossed the street and said, "I saw a van. It was near my mailbox last night." She described a scratch on the bumper. Officer Ramirez wrote everything down and said, "We will find them." The girl said, "Please do." I squeezed her hand and felt the thrum of her pulse. 2 paragraphs in the middle of the sequence became moments of tension where everything slowed and the choices felt enormous. We had to decide whether to confront the idea of what could happen if the perpetrator came back, or to stay silent and let the investigation run. The first tension paragraph is the second after we cut the gag, when she looked at me with eyes that had an ocean of fear and asked, "Will they come back?" The air seemed to thicken and my chest ached with responsibility. The second tension paragraph was when we waited for the detective to confirm the van's route and the possibility that there were other victims in the area. And the radio in the cruiser crackled with names and addresses, and none of them felt like enough. I remember breathing like a person trying to inflate a broken tire. The 5th and final night that summer was the one that stole my sleep for months. It began with a message on social media, a photo of a paper cup and a half-bitten sandwich, and a caption that said, "Found this behind your house." My stomach dropped. I had not posted a picture of the yard, and the tone felt deliberate. The account was anonymous and had photos of other small things, private things, like the mailbox, and then a snap of the back door with a shoelace looped over the handle. I knew at once that someone had been close enough to put their camera in the hedges. I called Miguel and Lena, and we walked around the perimeter of my house in the dark, flashlights like small moons. The smell of cut grass and engine oil hung low, and something metallic glinted near the compost bin, a small key with a plastic tag. I picked it up, and the tag had my apartment number on it. That key did not belong to me. The realization felt like a palm to the face. When we confronted this new breach of privacy, Lena demanded we call the police, and Miguel said we should set a trap. We argued with a rhythm like a drumbeat, each voice trying to shape the plan. I asked Lena, "Are you sure you want to do this?" She said, "Yes, I will not live like this." Miguel said, "We can wait by the back and flash our lights when someone comes." A neighbor, Mr. Thompson, came out and asked what was happening. I said, "Someone has been here." He said, "You should move your bike to the shed." I said, "Why?" His hand trembled, and he said, "Because I saw a man around the hedge last week, and I thought it was the night watchman." I will not be dramatic, but that detail mattered. We stayed up all night with flashlights and a cheap motion sensor light that Miguel rigged to a tree. At 3 in the morning, the light blinked, and there was a rustle and the crunch of shoes on gravel. Miguel hissed, "There he is." Lena whispered, "Call the cops." Miguel muttered, "Stay behind me." The man moved like someone used to slipping through small spaces. He ducked low, and his hands were gloved. He did not speak, but he carried a small camera that blinked with a red diode like an insect. We shouted, and he bolted. The chase through hedges and across fences was clumsy and hot and brief. He dropped a notebook with a name that was not mine, but that had my address underlined. We handed it to Officer Ramirez, who took it as evidence and said, "We will do a sweep of your cameras." The following week, the police removed samples and used a regional surveillance grid to track a route the man had taken. They managed to find him because he had refused to remove a distinctive sneaker print that matched prints from 2 other harassment complaints. He was arrested and charged with stalking. 2 paragraphs later, a tension moment arrived that had its own slow, terrible weight. After his arrest, someone anonymized details of our encounter and posted them publicly with speculation that we had staged it or that it was a lover's quarrel and not real stalking. The smear pushed me into a place where I had to prove my fear and my truth to strangers who wanted a story to tear apart. I felt my voice waver and thought of all the nights I had kept silent. The second long tension paragraph was the court appearance, where the man stared at me through glass and someone in the hall coughed too loud, and my hands would not stop shaking until the verdict. Through all 5 events, there were small things that became clues. A key, a smudge on the porch, a signature on a scrap of paper, a muddy boot print, a shoelace looped over a handle. I learned to notice textures and smells, the way other people notice faces. I started to catalog the way breath sounded different when someone was lying, and how the light in a room tells you if someone has been there long. Names became anchors, because people mattered. Lena kept me company, and wrote to the detective at length about the van. Miguel raged and then brought tools to secure doors. Evan offered to sleep on my couch and strummed his guitar to make the room familiar. Officer Ramirez was the one person who seemed to know how to transform fear into procedure. Detective Dr. Patel explained the forensics and called us when there was a lead. Mrs. Hargrove brought us cookies and an eyewitness account. Carla, the girl from the van, eventually moved in with an aunt and later wrote me a letter. Each person had a small action that mattered, and each name belonged to someone who made a choice that altered the arc of those nights. I am pausing here for a moment because when this part of the story settled in the middle, I asked readers to share if they had gone through something similar. If you have a story of a summer that shifted your life, write it in the comments, starting with "When I was scared," so I can read it with context. If you prefer to remain anonymous, feel free to say "I will stay anonymous" and just tell the beating heart of what happened. I read every message, and sometimes those messages become the next episodes. When fear happens, it shrinks your world, and when you share it, you enlarge it for someone else. I do not ask you to relive pain, but if you choose to share, know that your words will be met with the same care and respect I try to give in these videos. Thank you for being part of a community that listens. After the stories, the consequences arrived in plain bureaucratic forms. Police reports were filed at the Harbor Ridge station, and serial numbers and timestamps were recorded. The detective explained the chain of custody. That meant evidence must be packaged, labeled, and logged at each handoff, and that tampering could invalidate an entire case. The forensic photographs were uploaded to a database and matched against regional reports. I sat in the station and answered questions about the time the light flickered, the sound the man made, and how the van smelled. The procedures felt long and oddly comforting because they were a map through the chaos. There were interviews with social workers for Carla and a referral to a support group for people who had been harassed. I learned legal terms like stalking and protective order and restraining order, and how each one requires documentation and consistency. The court process took months, and the man who was arrested for the stalking pleaded not guilty at first and then accepted a plea deal after the forensic link to other crimes was demonstrated. 2 weeks after the final arrest, I had a moment alone on the porch where I noticed how the house sighed when the air moved through it, and how small things can mark a recovery. The epilogue of that summer is long and it is important, so I will take the time to explain how recovery felt at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. At 1 month, I was hyper-aware of small sounds. I checked locks 3 times and kept a light on by the door. I started therapy with a counselor named Dr. Mason, who worked in a small office above a florist. Our sessions were 2 long and honest conversations a week where I learned grounding techniques. The idea was to name 5 things I could see, then 4 I could touch, then 3 I could hear, then 2 I could smell, and 1 I could taste. Those exercises were clumsy at first, and then they became a habit, like locking a door. I also joined a community support group where Carla and others came to speak. They handed us tissues, and there was a woman named Rosa who... That first month, I still woke sweating and went to the porch to watch the light on the bay and convince my pulse to slow. At 3 months, the legal processes had moved along. The man who had been taken into custody for stalking was scheduled for a hearing, and we were given an update about evidence tying him to 2 other property intrusions along the coast. I felt stronger in small ways. I started to sleep with a smaller lamp and could leave the door unlocked when I was sure friends were nearby. I received a letter from Carla thanking me and saying she was starting school again and could not have done it without the people who refused to walk away. We filed a civil complaint later in the month, and I sat through a deposition where the detective asked me to recount dates and times. That exercise was painful because it was also precise, and I learned to watch my words. Lena came with me to every meeting, and Miguel turned up with coffee and a crooked joke. Evan kept bringing songs to the porch, and I learned that noise can be a kind of medicine if it is kind noise. 3 months in, I would still jump at a sudden step on stairs, but fewer mornings ended in tears. At 6 months, something in the rhythm changed enough for me to notice. The worst parts of the fear had become a veneer. I would sometimes go an entire day and not think about the man with a camera or the van at the bait shop. I rode my bike without checking over my shoulder, and I let sunlight land on the couch without thinking it must be monitored. I still carried the small notebook, and I kept some photos of evidence tucked inside a zipper. I started to feel like myself again, though that self had been edited by experience. I had a longer conversation with Dr. Patel, who said the accused had accepted a plea that included counseling and community service, and that the files would be sealed in a year if there were no further incidents. I wrote a short piece for a local paper about the importance of reporting things even when you feel silly, and the editor ran it with a photograph of Harbor Road at dusk. People sent messages that said thanks for speaking up, and some people said they had been too ashamed to tell anyone, and that hearing my voice made them ask for help. That was the part that surprised me the most, the way small acts of naming can open a door for others. There are a few things I want to leave you with that come from months of thinking and a lot of small choices. Trancado is not just a word, it is a policy. Lock doors, check windows, do not assume a light is a safeguard alone. When something feels wrong, tell someone, speak to a neighbor, or call the police, because the small details, the smell, the boot print, the half-bitten sandwich, may look meaningless alone, but together they form a pattern. Testimony matters, and community matters, because there were nights when nothing would have changed without people showing up. It is also okay to be afraid for a long time. Fear is a reaction, not a sentence. Seek help in practical ways. Join support groups, talk to a professional, and keep a ledger of the people who were kind. There is no single path to feeling whole again, but there are steps that help. If you want to hear more stories like these, subscribe to the channel, because I share first-person accounts and follow up with documentation when possible. If this episode moved you, consider leaving a comment with "When I was scared" and a short line about how you responded, because I read every story, and sometimes those comments become the next voice we bring forward. Sharing is a small act of courage. If you are in immediate danger, call your local emergency number. And if you have evidence, take photos and log dates and tell someone you trust. It is okay to ask for help. The summer of 5 harrowing nights did not ruin me. It sharpened me. It taught me to notice the thin things and to listen for the small oddities that announce a larger thread. It taught me that friends can be armor and that procedure can be a pathway back to order. I still check locks, and I still keep the porch light on sometimes, but I also walk down Harbor Road with my head up instead of down. I learned to tell the difference between a prank and a pattern, and to name the things that matter before the world tries to rename them for you. Lock your doors. Tell your story. Trancado stays, but speaking opens doors.